Hello there. My name is Jerome Flynn, and tonight we'll be taking a relaxing boat ride through England's picturesque waterways. But first, take a moment to cozy up and get comfortable. Take in a few deep, relaxing breaths, exhaling any tension from the day. And when you're ready, allow your eyes to slowly close. Now that you're settled in, let's begin tonight's story. On this calm afternoon, the water is impossibly still. On either side of its crystal surface, long reeds stretch into the setting sunlight without so much as a whisper of movement. The water is so unmoving, it seems not liquid at all, but rather a smooth and solid surface of beautiful glass, perfectly reflecting the bridges that span across its width so completely that they are no longer arches, but full, symmetrical circles. The air is just as tranquil as the waterway, the very stillness that only occurs when evening sun follows afternoon rain. It is crisp, fresh, with a thick, low-hanging film of mist just tickling the water. Building from the silence, like the first delicate notes of a single string introducing an orchestra, the air begins to move. The rhythmic sound of a swan's wings, deliberate and slow, as it flies just above the surface of the water, brings life to this languid scene. As the swan nears the middle of the canal, it spreads out its webbed feet and, just for a few seconds, appears to dance upon the water like a graceful ballerina before simply floating along the surface. The swan does not need to call out for attention, for this majestic bird is elegance itself. Instead, merely moving parallel to the water, the only indication that it moves at all are the gentle ripples that span out in hypnotic waves. A narrow boat is tied to the towpath on the side of the waterway. The boat is slim, uniquely British, and it silently keeps watch over the still mirror of the canal. This canal is not alone. It is part of a network that stretches across the countryside, weaving between towns and villages and spooling out onto wider rivers, creating a web of connecting pathways with a fascinating history as long and as winding as the canals themselves. The water here was first harnessed by the Romans. They built the canals and linked one river to another for their crops. Then, the British were faced with the challenge of moving large amounts of supplies and goods using roads that were muddy and difficult to follow. So, Britain became the first country in the world to form a network of canals that spanned the nation. The system of canals grew steadily, linking major cities in the south, the Midlands, the north of England, and Wales. Before long, the waterways were not just liquid roads, but the very lifeblood of the United Kingdom. But these canals were not very wide, and, as such, special boats needed to be made. This was how the narrowboat was born. Long and slim, narrowboats were originally hewn from oak and elm and were pulled by huge shire horses with thick, strong legs who were, in turn, encouraged gently along the side of the water by a minder. In the early days, the boat's decks were open, so supplies could be loaded easily. Everything from mail to luggage and people, eager to travel along the gentle passages guided by expert boatmen. At first, the life of a boatman could be quite lonely, as their families remained on land while they worked. However, as time passed, they started to bring their spouses and children on board to join them on their travels. The rear part of the narrowboat was transformed into a small but cozy family home. Wood-burning stoves were added for warmth and cooking, and beds placed for more restful sleep. A whole new form of folk artwork was born, featuring crochet decorations and brightly flowered kitchenware, drawing inspiration from the beautiful countryside the canals wound through. Imaginations sparked, and the boats themselves were adorned with colorfully detailed scenes of fairy tale castles and kingdoms. Then, horses were attired, and a new magic was introduced: engines. However, time, like the water that carries the boats, never remains still. And as roads improved and cars were invented, these water networks slowly became a thing of the past. Trains and trucks replaced the slender narrowboats, and canals began to become overgrown, unused, and left to return to the wild. But as life became more fast-paced, something remarkable happened to these would-be lost waterways. People began to crave the slow pace of life that the canals could offer. They began to long for a tranquil journey on the water. Instead of rushing, they wanted to relax and take their time, moving slowly and steadily through a place, rather than rushing to get to it. They wanted to breathe it all in. This need brought the British canals back to the present. Old vessels were restored to offer comfortable accommodations, complete with full-sized beds, kitchens, and bathrooms. Although modern touches were added, the beautiful paintings and traditional art of the old canal workers were preserved. Narrowboats began to reappear, dressed proudly in the primary colors such as pillar box red, emerald green, and canary yellow. Their new names were inspired by nature and British culture: Kingfisher, Merlin, and Chiff-Chaff. And so those who were promised the fastest way of slowing down began to take trips on the old canal network, buying or simply hiring a narrowboat to explore this ancient way of journeying across space. The names of these channels are still legendary in Britain, with the Grand Union Canal, the longest in the country, spanning between the two major cities of Birmingham and London. There's the Llangollen Canal in Wales, where you can still enjoy the experience of being pulled along by horse on an old, restored working boat. Then, in Scotland, there's the Caledonian Canal, which journeys from one side of the country to the other, from Inverness to Fort William, taking in magically named places such as Neptune's Staircase, Urquhart Bay, and, of course, the famous Loch Ness. Of all the canals in the network, one of the prettiest is the Oxford Canal, which weaves its way through the heart of the country. Free of the huge buildings that dominate other channels, this canal makes its way down from the Three Spires of Coventry to the renowned University of Oxford. Meandering from the center of the West Midlands city Our journey by narrowboat begins from Hawkesbury Junction, where a cast-iron bridge marks the point where working boats used to wait for their orders. The boat passes slowly beneath this yawning structure and softly stirs the water as it moves, bound for the countryside between here and the next city of Rugby. It's quiet and peaceful, with little noise other than the purr and hum of the engine. The skipper clasps the tiller in his hand, the cool brass reassuring beneath his fingertips, and gradually steers the boat around the wide and arcing bends in the canal. In the world of narrowboats, nothing, not even steering, happens quickly. Instead, directing a narrowboat is all about the journey, a methodical and relaxing path that moves at a slow, unhurried pace, giving us ample time to take in the view. Another benefit of the narrowboat is that it does not scare away the birds. Instead, they approach with open curiosity, occasionally stopping to feed on the moss that clings to the boat's bottom. As the boat moves through the little hamlets, somewhere in the distance, the motorists go about their journeys on straight and regulated roads, unaware that there is another, more relaxing and rewarding way to travel. The skipper smiles contently, nodding to us warmly with the tip of his hat, happy to be taking the whole world in so sublimely. The water is pressed forward as the little narrowboat weaves its way past basins where other boats are moored. Hawthorn trees line the route, their dense and knotted branches forming hedge-like clusters that hug the canal as a kind of secret tunnel. Behind the tree line, the gentle sound of sheep grazing can be heard. A flock of Canada geese lands pleasingly on the water that ripples in the boat's wake. The train line joins the water for a while, snaking alongside it before the canal loses it again and seeps under overhanging trees that form a fantastic canopy above the vessel, as though it were a grand entryway into a magical kingdom. The narrowboat glides effortlessly over the first aqueduct, stroking past clusters of teasel topped off by purple flowers. The beautiful plants are visited by goldfinch, which flutter about, eating in peace. A narrow swing bridge is pushed out the way, allowing the boat to pass a small, grassy hill that marks the site of a medieval castle at the edge of Brinklow. Shortly after, the charming grove of All Oaks Wood passes by, the branches swaying in a soft, warm breeze. The towpath that once listened to the hooves of towing horses now, instead, hears the leisurely steps from people out for a stroll. As they see the pretty little narrowboat passing by, they smile and wave. The passageway gradually shifts to more man-made rock as the boat passes through the Newbold Tunnel. At its exit sits a little 15th century church with a turreted top. The stained-glassed windows throw shimmering rainbows in the morning light. Eventually, the boat crosses the River Avon, and the canal now passes through the outskirts of Rugby. Though started as an agricultural town, It is now famed for the ball game that shares its name, and has been featured in many a story, penned by authors such as Charles Dickens, Arthur Ransom, and Elizabeth Gaskell. A bell chimes gently somewhere past the outline of cottages and shops. Now, to reach the countryside, the boat must navigate a set of locks, climbing up to Hill Morton. Locks are a step system that control the flow of water and allow the boat to climb up a hill. Each one features its own set of gates, painted black and white and made of wood. Opening the first, the boat sails inside before it is shut, creating a chamber. Using a windlass, the sluices are open or shut to allow water in or out, so that the boat can ascend or descend the height. As with most things on this relaxing journey, this process can never be rushed. Each step is part of a methodical practice that takes patience. No matter how many times it is experienced, it is always a magical sight to see a boat climbing up or down the watery steps. Soon, the city is left behind, and the canal swings slowly southeast as the countryside comes into view once more. The village of Braunston signals the joining of the Grand Union Canal, which here makes its way down towards England's sprawling capital. But that is not where this little boat is headed. Instead, we pass the turn and begin on the southern section of the Oxford Canal. Our journey isn't over yet. It's this particular part of the watercourse that held on to the tradition of horse-drawn boats much longer than others in the network. The steeds may now live in the adjacent fields, but the slow pace of the rippling water of the canal remains the same. Along the edges here, instead of concrete bollards for tying up the boats that need to rest, there are wooden tree trunks, carved especially for this purpose, making this whole section feel less man-made and more of nature's own design. The small enclave of Napton-on-the-Hill is tillered around next, where the large, white wooden sails on the red brick tower of the Napton windmill swing around and around in slow circles. On the other side of the canal are acres of extensive farmland, spreading out towards the horizon as far as the eye can see. As the canal winds its way onward, bright yellow cowslips and thick green ivy coat the towpath. Small stone buildings dot the coastline, sharing the space with thatched-roofed cottages of red brick. As the boat bobs under a weighted lifting bridge, we cross the invisible county line from Warwickshire to Oxfordshire. Once more, patience is required to raise these wooden platforms, bit by bit, and soon the red brick houses are replaced with the golden brown tones of Cotswold stone. Next, through more locks, is the small village of Cropreddy, famous for its annual festival of soothing folk melodies that blanket the boat with soft music. Keeping with the creative theme, lines of poetry in gold letters begin to appear on black signs dotted along the so-called Queen of the Oxford Canal, guiding the journey forward. Beyond, the canal bends once more, bound for Banbury, a place whose name sounds so tuneful it belongs in a nursery rhyme. Here the air is often scented with cocoa and freshly baked bread from the many food factories that call it home. Delicious traces of honey brioche float along the boat. It's not long before another remnant of the canal history passes us by. Established way back in the 1700s, it might not look like much now, but it was here that the writer Lionel Rolt repaired a small narrowboat called Cressy, in which he lived. He recorded his adventures and the history of these waterways in his book called Narrowboat. Had it not been for him, the idea to use these once industrial watery mainlines for pleasure rather than need may never have been realized. Traces of industry are soon left behind as our little boat moves beyond the boundaries of Banbury. We pass small towns and villages with delightfully English names, from the royal-sounding King's Sutton to Clifton, Steeple Aston, and Upper and Lower Hayford. Among these is Adderbury, where the bells strapped to the ankles of traditional Morris dancers tinkle as they move. Around here, the canal does a little dance itself, courting the border of the county of Northamptonshire and drifting in and out of tree-lined segments. The canal curves back and forth until it reaches a wider point outside Thrupp. Here, amid the reeds and water lilies, a family of swans slip by the narrow boat, several fluffy grey chicks trailing two regal parrots. On the grassy banks are a number of chocolate box cottages which overlook the water from wooden-framed windows. Our narrow boat turns a final corner, and we are now on the home stretch towards Oxford. Before it reaches this historic city, it interlaces the countryside, passing a Norman church with medieval windows and ornate alabaster carvings still intact. As the boat passes under the final railway line, a small school in the area of Summertown appears in the distance. The gentle laughter of children at play wafts over for a moment as the boat slides into its destination. One former pupil was Kenneth Graham, the author of the classic children's book, The Wind in the Willows, famous for its animal characters, one of whom resolutely declares, "There is nothing, absolutely nothing, half so much worth doing as simply messing about in boats." Now, The magnificent buildings of Oxford rise above the water, its bricks given a golden hue by the evening sunlight. The university that makes this leafy municipality so famous has existed since the 11th century, and as such is one of the oldest educational institutes in the English-speaking world. On the side of the waterway, dozens of other narrow boats are moored up, each decorated as uniquely as the last, with jovial designs creating a kaleidoscope of color on the placid waters. Greenery lines the towpath, creeping through any stone walls or pavements as though no obstacle at all. And it is here, amid the people and buildings, that our journey along the canal officially finishes. But that doesn't stop the water, for the channels never truly end. If so desired, our little boat could carry on, much as the water itself does, traveling down the Sheepwash Canal and on to the River Thames, where the mighty ocean beckons beyond, slowly, steadily, and endlessly.